This video has been produced to help you use the Decarbonisation Interventions Estimator. The estimator has been designed to be used in conjunction with the business as usual estimator. So, if you haven't already, you'll need to go back and fill this in first to generate your BAU forecast for your estate. You'll then be ready to use this estimator to carry out an assessment of potential decarbonisation interventions against your BAU forecast. The outputs will help you start to consider prioritisation and phasing of projects to meet any interim and longer-term net zero goals for your estate. Whilst the estimator provides estimates to help you start to make these decisions, you are still highly likely to need to commission feasibility studies for projects you wish to take forward. The aim of this video is to walk you through the tool, giving you a high-level overview of what to fill in and in what order. However, for more detailed information on specific inputs or how the tool works, make sure you refer back to the combined estimator user guide, and this should have been downloaded as part of your zip file. So, once you've had a read through of the relevant sections in the user guide and you've had a look at the user notes tab, you can move on and actually start to fill in the estimator. So the first step is going to be to import your BAU forecast, and this is going to act as a baseline for your estate to measure the impact of interventions against. This is something we generated when we filled in the BAU estimator, so all we're going to need to do is copy this across. So I've got mine to hand at the bottom here, and I just saved it as something useful so I could find it easily in my files. And all I need to do is copy all of the columns and paste them into the interventions estimator. And I'm just going to do this over the top of the example that's been included. Again, if you're wondering where this has come from, make sure to have a look at the BAU tutorial that we posted, as this will explain the steps to generating it. So that's done now, and we can move on to start having a look at interventions for our estate. For demonstrating how to fill in the Inputs tab, I'm going to use the same example estate that I used when I recorded the BAU tutorial. So the first thing you need to do is start with the building level information columns. And this is really simple. We're just going to have our BAU estimator to hand, and I'm going to go and copy all of these columns across. I just need to make sure that I'm pasting this in over the top of the example there. Then you can start to apply interventions to your buildings or sites across your estate. And using the project start year columns, this allows you to phase projects depending on when you want to implement them. So we're going to start by looking at the energy efficiency columns, which are the ones in yellow, and these cover lighting, BMS, and building fabric. So the layout is pretty similar for each of these. We need to indicate the project start year, which is when we'll first start making capital payments back on our investment. The percentage of the site that the intervention applies to, and this is useful in cases where you may have already undertaken a partial intervention at a site, so we're making sure that we're scaling this project appropriately. And then finally, the requirement that gives you 3 levels for the upgrade from low to high. So for example, for lighting, this is going to correspond to luminosity requirements for LEDs. So a hospital is likely to have a higher requirement than, say, an office or accommodation block. Similarly, for BMS, low would be the case where an existing BMS system is in operation, however it needs an upgrade or an extension, whereas high would be the case where we're fitting a completely new system. And then for building fabric, a low level of upgrade would be where we're making one improvement, so we might be doing roof insulation, whereas high would be multiple, for example, roof, walls, and double glazing. There's also another section that gives you a bit more flexibility with manually entering any location-specific interventions or any projects that have previously been undertaken where the change in electricity and heat is known, as well as any capital or operational costs. You can then start to look at heat decarbonisation projects for your sites and buildings. So again, you'd need to indicate when the project would be starting, select the new heating system from the drop-down, and give an indication as to the cost range, whether it's low, medium, or high. And the user guide goes into more detail on what each of these levels means, but essentially it's going to depend on suitability of integrating the new system into existing temperature networks and efficiencies. And also certain more complex sites might have higher heat requirements, for example, a hospital. You might be able to see that some of the rows are greyed out, and this is where we have buildings that are supplied by a central heat network from an energy centre. So what you'd have to do here is you would apply the new heating system to the energy centre. So in this case, we have these two buildings that are supplied by this main energy centre. So I'd select, for example, ground source heat pump, and this would then offset any heat currently distributed through the existing system. So that's how you deal with that. There's also the option to look at on-site renewable generation, and I'd recommend reading the user guide before you start to fill this in, as it provides a bit more information around different types of installation and site suitability. Again, a lot of the columns are quite similar. You've got a project start year, you indicate the type of installation from the drop down, and a level of resource for either solar or wind. So, for example, a high level of solar resource would indicate that the array is south facing with very little periodic shading, whereas for wind, this is going to be dictated by the average wind speed at that particular location. And it's worth noting that for an onshore wind turbine, you'll probably be looking at a design hub height of around 20 metres to get an idea of what the average wind speed would be. You also need to give an indication as to the cost of the installation, and this is going to be based on the complexity of your site, so the support structure available, the electrical connections, and access. And then finally, for solar, you need to give an idea as to the maximum area available for the installation, and this is going to help with sizing of the system based on typical area requirements for a standard panel. And then the only other thing to note is, I'm sure as you'll have noticed, there's quite a few rows greyed out in the wind installation section. And this is basically where we've got sites with multiple buildings. And the calculator is going to assign the wind turbine to a single building for that site, usually the energy centre, and then distribute the benefits across all of the buildings. So in this example, this should actually be in here because this is the energy centre for that site. And then also, before you start adding in wind projects, you'll have to have made sure that you've already done an assessment as to the space you've got available and whether it's sufficient for installing a wind turbine. And also, you'll have to have looked at the exclusion zones that apply. You'll have noticed that I've gone back and added in some projects for our example estate, just so that we have something to work with when we move on to the output tabs. So once you're happy that you filled this in for your own estate, you can move on to the selections tab. And here, there's a couple of key things to note. The first is that there's two reference years that we need to input. The first is the financial reference year, which is used for all of the discounted cash flows and for working out the net present value of your future investments. So to make sure, and this is a really important point, to make sure that you're aligning with the BAU forecast, you need to use the same year that you used as your consumption reference year on the selections tab in that estimator. So in our example, we used 2022, so I've just used this again here. And then we've also got the option to add an output reference year, and this allows you to basically change the horizon that you're looking at when you look at outputs. So instead of 2050, you might have net zero goals for 2040, so you might want to have a look at that there. And I'll explain more about this later on. And then once you're happy with all of that, the next important thing to do is click Update Output. And this is really important. It's going to make sure that everything you've put in so far is carried forward into the Outputs tab. So we're just going to go ahead and click this, but it might take a couple of minutes to run, so I'll come back. Once this is complete, you can move on and finally start looking at all of your options. And we've broken down the outputs into 3 different tabs, and I'm going to briefly take you through these. However, remember there's more detail in the user guide. So we'll start with the Output Summary tab, and this is our high-level overview or aggregate across our entire estate and all of our interventions. We've got a really useful options appraisal table at the top here, and this gives us a snapshot of what our estate could look like in 2050. So we've got all of our different types of project down the side, and we can compare these based on some of the metrics across the top. So cost metrics look at capital expenditure, and then our OPEX gives us an idea of what operational costs would be in 2050, as well as energy costs. We can then look at how our energy consumption would change if we applied all of our interventions, as well as our emissions trajectory. And the two rows at the bottom here gives you an idea of that. So in this example, our interventions route would reduce our grid imports by 2050, and also our scope 1 and our scope 2 emissions. The tables below provide a bit more detail around some of these metrics, and make sure you have a look at those, and they compare our base case and our pathway. And then we've also got some really useful graphs that have been generated to help you visualize how the two pathways differ. So these would be really useful to cut and paste into any strategy documents. The other thing to note is that you can drill this down a bit by selecting a specific site. So I'm just going to go ahead and select University Hospital. And then also I could select a particular building. And again, the graphs will be updated to reflect that particular building. The only thing then is if you want to go back, you can't just click on another site. You have to go back and make sure that you've cleared all of your filters like so, and then that gives you the freedom to select a different site and building and just have a play around. So we're going to move on now to look at the output analysis tab, and this tab is pretty similar in terms of the different types of graphs. However, we can have a bit more flexibility with really drilling down into the detail. So we've got more filtering in this dashboard, and essentially this allows us to layer up interventions or to isolate a specific intervention. So I'm just going to select a sample site and a building. And then, for example, I might just want to isolate the impact of our heat decarbonisation projects. So that's really interesting. Or I might want to just look at solar. Or you can even split by whether it's affecting electricity or heat. So I might just select electricity. So this will then give us a snapshot of the particular interventions that are affecting our electricity usage. So as we can see, we've got new heating, LED and solar, and how they look against the BAU trajectory. So we can have a scroll through the graph to look at how our energy costs will be impacted, as well as our emissions trajectory and energy consumption versus demand. So I'd recommend having a little play, and you can layer up specific interventions to give you an overall picture of which projects you might want to take forward. And then our final outputs tab is the interventions one, and this just gives us a tabular view of all of our different projects across our estate. And this is really useful if you quickly want to do a filter to rank your projects depending on a certain criteria. So for example, if we wanted to get an idea of relative capital costs for future sort of budget planning, I can rank in this column from largest to smallest, like so, or I might want to rank based on average emission savings from when the project will start. So in this case, because these are treated as reductions, they're negative numbers, so I'm actually going to rank from smallest to largest. And this is going to give me an indication as to the project that's going to have the greatest impact on emissions at the top of the table. The other thing to note is that whilst this column says that it accounts for total emission savings from when the project started up until 2050, we've actually indicated 2040 at the top, and this links back to the selections tab where we picked 2040 as our output reference year. So this has basically changed the timescale for this and overwritten it, so we're actually getting the picture in 2040 rather than at 2050. So I hope you'll have found that this tutorial was useful in walking you through the Decarbonisation Interventions Estimator and getting you to start thinking about how interventions could help you meet your decarbonisation targets. Obviously, as we said at the start, these estimates will need to be tested by feasibility studies for the projects that you decide to take forward. The only other thing to note is that in the Selections tab, there is the option to export your outputs if you wish to conduct some further analysis. Other than that, if you've got any feedback or any further questions and if anything wasn't clear, then feel free to reach out at psdecarbguidance@es.catapult.org.uk. Thanks for watching.